welcome everybody. Welcome to Dr. Barua and Dr. Ghosh for joining us at this incredible panel discussion. And to start off with this particular panel discussion, virtual event is being organized in collaboration between Project Statecraft, which is a youth-led non-partisan think tank and educational enterprise. We've been working for the past 5 years in the areas of learning, research, and advocacy, where we try to bring young people at the center of uh, anticipatory policy making, as well as policy discourse in the current times. And the India Foreign Policy Project, which is focused on promoting discourse around foreign policy of India, as well as global affairs in the region. Thank you so much, Dr. Anamika Barua and Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh for joining us, as well as everybody else for taking out the time and being available for this particular panel discussion. I think it's going to be a very exciting one. Uh, to introduce our guest today, Dr. Anamika Barua is a professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Guwahati, and is also a visiting faculty member at AIT Bangkok. Uh, Dr. Barua has been a member of several high-level committees for Government of India, especially in the climate change and water space. She was part of the Technical Advisory Committee for India's climate communication to the UNFCCC, which made quite significant waves, if I may add, this year. And at the same time, was also part of the drafting committee for India's water policy, which is constituted by Ministry of Jal Shakti. I think she's the perfect person when it comes to discussing these nuanced issues of hydropolitics, and we'll get to that very shortly. Our second guest today is Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, who is the Vice President of Development Studies at the Observer Research Foundation, one of the pioneering policy think tanks and foreign policy think tanks in India. He is also the Senior Director of the ORF Kolkata Center. And Dr. Ghosh has been the president of the Indian Society for Ecological Economics and was also the director of the Think 20 India Secretariat during India's G20 presidency in 2023. Previously, he has held various faculty positions at Terry School of Advanced Studies, which we know to be one of the foremost institutions when it comes to environmental and climate change studies in India. At the same time, he's advised the World Wildlife Fund on establishing the ecological economics practice. I think the combination of these two incredible speakers is going to shed a lot of light on topics which are not visited as much within the sphere of hydropolitics as well. So with that, I welcome you both. And to get started, I would love for you to also introduce yourselves if I missed out on any of the introductions which are very relevant today, or you'd want a lot more people to know about. But there's also this one question which has been bugging me ever since we started thinking about this particular topic in itself, which was that if we were to try to understand the situation better, especially taking a lens of vulnerability and opportunities that exist in the South Asian region, as well as its decision makers due to the issue of hydropolitics, how concerned or how excited should we be about this area and why? I think a lot of people would want to know why it's important for them in the first place.
You want me to go first?
Yes, Dr. Barua, that would be great.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me here on this panel. And it's really nice to share the panel with Nilanjan, who is also a good friend. One common thing that we both share is that we are both ecological economists. So that's also nice. Your question, Abhijit, I think one of the thing that we need to understand is what is hydropolitics, right? Like so we usually talk about politics, but here we are also bringing the word hydro. So we mean to say that, how political interactions happen surrounding shared water, like such as the transboundary water resource. So here we try to understand that when you politicize a particular issue related to, say, utilization of the resource or management of the resource or sharing together the resource, how does South Asia, negotiates, or how do you talk to each other, both countries? Having said that, I feel that, of course, there are a lot of challenges, but then there are a lot of opportunities as well. So when we say challenges, South Asia hydropolitics, given the vulnerability in the sense that we also have a lot of disasters around these river basins, I would say that, one of the most important things we all need to keep in mind is that when you have diverse domestic interests, diverse priorities, it is bound to, that we will have conflict. So conflict is not something that one should be so much worried about, because if there is no conflict, then there will be no discussion also. So first thing is that both conflict and cooperation, both are two sides of the coin, but they are also both very, very important. Let me just give you an example. For example, we keep talking about, say, for example, the Indus Water Treaty, which is frequently challenged due to disputes between India and Pakistan, particularly regarding the India's construction of dams and irrigation project that Pakistan views as a threat to water security or water supply. Similarly, now we are talking a lot about China's dam on the Yalong Sangpo. We are also talking about the Kosi barrage, which many a times brings floods not only to actually Nepal but also to Bihar. So what I'm trying to say here is that these are some of the way when you look at hydropolitics, because this becomes a political issue, political agenda, and you bring it up in very high platforms to discuss about it. But one thing we need to remember, that everything is actually not inherently negative about hydropolitics, because when you politicize water issues, governments and stakeholders particularly bring them to the forefront of be it bilateral or multilateral discussions, which at times helps for moving towards constructive engagement and agreement. And here the very interesting example is the 2000 when we had a flash flood originating from a river in Tibet, and China had not informed India about this kind of water that is flowing down, which resulted in a lot of loss of livelihoods and life in India, particularly in Arunachal and Assam. This actually, at the end of the day, led to the first memorandum of understanding, because India side was prompted to ask China to address this issue seriously. And as such, China had to, at the end of the day, decide and agree with India's demand of sharing these hydrological data. And today, till date, we are still moving towards this kind of the MOU that we have. It gets renewed, for example, every 5 years. So if you ask me, I will have simply 4 important points that if you want the hydropolitics to stay or bring more positive nuances rather than negative, and bringing South Asian countries together amidst the existing vulnerability, I think one of the most important thing is transparency. We do need to have a mechanism for everything, whether we are coming up with an infrastructure project, data sharing. So the transparency related to river flows, precipitation, dam operations, all of these are very important, because it's not a question of we need it or not, it's a question of building trust. So trust building is one of the most important thing for any kind of hydropolitics you're talking about. And particularly, this is also because it enhances transparency. It is extremely important that we promote regional integration, which means we do need to have multilateral frameworks to address water, particularly when these rivers flows through multiple countries, not just 2 countries. We also need to adapt to the changing or uncertainties around climate change. Something which was, say, signed or decided 20 or 30 years back may not be relevant today, given the kind of climate-induced risks like floods, droughts, glacier retreat that we are coming across. And finally, we need to have a lot of public participation, which means that how these local communities get affected when there is no transboundary cooperation or there is a cooperation. So this is also something, because then it resonates with the ground reality. So these are some of the things I think yet to be seen. I mean, we have not really seen this when we talk about South Asian rivers working together. These are some of these things can actually enhance the understanding and existing cooperative element in the South Asian countries. Last but not the least, because I also come from an academic institution, I think we need to also teach hydrodiplomacy, hydropolitics in educational institutions, because most of the IIT students, for example, finally take up bureaucratic positions. And then there is always a challenge. How do you, because they understand water only in one way, how do you give them that, foundation so that they can negotiate well, they can understand the river well? Yeah, I'm going to stop here. And yeah, very happy to respond to any further questions.
Thank you, Dr. Barua. Dr. Ghosh, over to you.
I think that was a great summary by Anamika. Uh, well, there are two, 3 points uh, essentially that emerge from Anamika's interventions. The first and foremost thing that she mentioned, it was quite implicit and rather, I would say, explicit from what she said. Hydropolitics in South Asia, as such, has emerged also as a two-level game. It is not merely confined to a game between two nations. But even if you look at some of these, say, uh, whether it's the Ganges, whether you talk about the Tista, in fact, one of the critical tributaries of the Brahmaputra, or suppose, say, when you talk about the Indus, there is always this federal structure which keeps on affecting the international transboundary negotiations. If you recall the Ganges Water Treaty of 1996, let me come to that first. Now, one thing that we must keep in mind that water happens to be a state subject as far as India is concerned. So who sweetened the deal at that point in time? It was actually the state of West Bengal which had to agree with it. And the finance minister of West Bengal, during the erstwhile finance minister of West Bengal, Ashim Das Gupta, he essentially acted as the negotiator from Indian side. Now, on the other side, if you look at Tisla, that is which also has also emerged as a two-level game. The same in the same situation, what we find is that the conflictual federalism by itself is playing a critical role. It's also because of the fact that the center might want to get into some form of a negotiation with Bangladesh. But again, the states, which are major players in this part of the basin, are turning out to be impediments in the context of any form of negotiation. Now, it is not that we should going to blame one particular state, whether it's the state of West Bengal, which is acting as the impediment, but the fact remains that over the Tista, especially in the Sikkim stretch, you have at least 26 hydropower constructions. Some of them are operative, some of them are non-operative. Now, in the process, what has happened is that the river is being killed, practically. So, so this is one very critical element that we have to remember when we talk about transboundary waters, or suppose say any form of hydropolitical dynamics between nations as far as South Asia is concerned. Second comes the issue of data. Now, in most cases, what we don't find in the public domain is the presence of hard data, by way of which we can really get into some informed negotiation. And it creates some kind of what we call the information asymmetries, resulting in conflictual outcomes. Just as when you talk about, even in the context of the Ganges Water Treaty, I'll come to Brahmaputra, China, that's a different ballgame altogether. But if we talk about the Ganges Water Treaty, I mean, in many cases, there has been this assertion by counterpart on part of Bangladesh that India has not released adequate amount of water. But when I was checking, in fact, on the data that has been shared by the Joint River Commission, JRC, in Bangladesh itself, it clearly shows that the water that is getting, I mean, Bangladesh is getting more water in their first measuring station at Hardinge Bridge than what is being released at Farakka. So, and nobody is taking that into consideration, in fact, in the form of negotiation, and nobody is putting this across. Now, what is the reason that we are releasing less water and they are receiving more water? It is not that we are releasing less water than what is mandated. We are releasing always more than what is mandated. If you take data from 2008 till 2023, 24, whatever is available, in fact, in public domain. But at the same time, there is addition of at least 15 to 20% of water. Now, the issue is that there is clear lack of understanding of hydrological data, even among the engineers in the Joint Rivers Commission. This is something, when I asked this question to one of the engineers, in fact, of the JRC in Bangladesh, but why are you receiving 15 to 20% more water than what is being released from India? They couldn't explain that to me. Third element is that there hasn't been an integrated approach when it comes to what we call governance of the transboundary rivers. We have been, whenever we talked about negotiations or we entered into any kind of treaty with water sharing or data sharing, it has only been with the liquid flow or the water flow itself. But when you talk about the major South Asian rivers, they're all Himalayan rivers, whether it is the Indus, whether it is the Ganges, whether it is the Brahmaputra. Brahmaputra is the most sediment-laden river in the world. It's higher than that of the total, what we call the suspended sediment load is higher than that of the Yellow River. Ganges also carries a huge amount of sediment, so does the Indus. So, as has lately been conceptualized, if you really talk of a river system in this part of the world, it should be described as the dynamic equilibrium of what we call the webs, the water, energy, biodiversity, and sediment. If you suppose say if that is how you are describing the flow regime, and you say create one construction which impedes on the flow of this entire system, and say a hydropower project, what will happen? Maybe the sediment will drop at the upstream of the project. That affects the biodiversity and the ecosystem services further downstream. So the entire equilibrium of the flow regime gets disrupted. And that is what we are having, in fact, in large parts of the Ganges basin, because the Ganga delta is shrinking, because the sediment is not flowing further downstream. Sea level rise, especially, in fact, in the Ganga basin in the Indian component, that is in West Bengal, is leading to eating up of the land. And eventually there are two forces, because the soil resuscitation is simply not happening as the sediment is not flowing further downstream here. So the Ganges delta, which also includes the Indian Sundarbans delta, that is shrinking in the process. Now the fourth element, which Anamika mentioned, that is about multilateralism. We have never indulged in multilateralism so far in any form of river basin governance negotiation or even in form of data sharing. It has always been bilateralism. And that is what impedes what we call an integrated approach. Because if we have to talk about an integrated approach, the first and foremost thing is that the river basin should be the unit of governance. And here we are just talking of certain stretches. What do we have in the context of the Ganges Water Treaty? How much water is getting released from the Farakka itself? What do we have, in fact, in the context of the Brahmaputra-China data sharing treaty? How much the three stations, particularly Nushya, Yangkun, and the other one, from which how much, what is the amount of water that is getting released in the process? And you're sharing data that twice a day. That is also during the high seasons. That's all. So the entire comprehensiveness of any kind of river or what we call the very integrated approach and a comprehensive agreement mechanism is missing in the process. And that is resulting in a very reductionist way of looking at river basins. So in the process, whereas we are trying to get into agreements, we are trying to get into any form of negotiation, we are trying to address one specific problem without realizing that while addressing that problem, we are creating further problems further downstream. While trying to address the issue of the Kolkata port, we created problems for the Sundarbans by constructing the Farakka Barrage. So until and unless we have a whole of basin approach, these problems are only going to get aggravated. Let me stop here.
That's a very interesting insight, Dr. Ghosh, and something which hasn't come up in a lot of the literature. But it's also the perfect segue to the next question, which I had very specifically for you, especially when we talk about the integrated approach and multilateralism. I think ever since the change of administration in the United States, energy as a discussion on the multilateral fora has emerged as a very critical topic. So, and when we look at the countries in this region as well, as you and Dr. Baru also pointed out. In some ways, on across multiple times in history, water flowing between countries in South Asia has been used as a bargaining chip in a lot of these negotiations and in a lot of the different kinds of negotiations as well that have happened. Considering the change in administration there, considering this nature of water as a negotiation point bilaterally between countries in the region, and the way global economy stands today, where I think every government in the world is trying to figure out that when this global world order shuffle is completed, which the Trump administration is determined to do, especially when it comes to the energy markets, as well as other markets that are present, who comes out as a winner? And everywhere we think about, it's the South Asian countries, especially India, Vietnam. These are the countries which are being touted as who might emerge as champions at the end of this. Now, in this particular scenario, how do you foresee the hydropolitics negotiations and discourse in South Asian countries, especially when we think about energy prices, when we think about the untapped industrialization, which requires a lot of energy? And even in Europe, we are seeing that just the energy price difference can deindustrialize an entire continent, as well as meeting the larger needs of a growing population. So where do you see these negotiations going if you base it in this particular context of today?
So if you were talking in terms of hydropower, especially, uh, definitely it's going to be cleaner, comparatively cleaner than the traditional sources. But let us also look at the other costs. It is not merely the cost of producing that power through the run of the river project, but the problem essentially arises with uh, the fact that a run of the river project brings with itself, well, as far as the water flow regime is concerned, that might not be altered substantially. Maybe, in fact, an hourly hydrograph change or something of that sort might be noticed. But a river system is not merely water. A river system is also about the sediment. It is also about the biodiversity. So, what is the cost? How is it going to affect the fisheries economy further downstream by altering the flow regime? How is it going to affect the very ecosystem services or the supporting service of the ecosystem that this flow regime is offering for the downstream? So what is the social cost in the process? That has to be taken into account. That is one element. Second is that, well, there are also in fact, as far as hydropower projects are concerned, lately when they were constructed in the Himalayan system, they also faced with a lot of I mean, protests, problems with rehabilitation, problem issues related to EIAs. So these are some of the that essentially has delayed the entire implementation of the project and has escalated the costs. Third element is, in many cases, we have not really checked on the seismicity. Even if we have taken into consideration, maybe the 100 years or 150 years or whatever, but there are projects which are happening in seismic prone zones. We are not really, our seismic science has not really evolved to that extent, especially I would say in the Eastern Himalayan component. And that raises clear questions on the feasibility of such projects. In many cases, we also find that these hydropower projects have been rendered, I mean, they simply didn't get into a break-even mode precisely because the capex turned out to be very high. And somehow the operating costs also turned out to be very high. And many of them had to close down. Now we have, as I was giving you an example, that if you say drive across the Tista River in Sikkim, you will find that there are at least 26 or 27 hydropower projects. 50% of them or more than that are not operating. They are just there. Now in the process that has killed the river, especially during the dry season. So there is a huge amount of sedimentation that are there, in fact, in the upstream of those projects. And the water simply can't flow during the dry season. And then you have problems for the downstream with Bangladesh, precisely because whether it is in West Bengal or in Bangladesh, dry season paddy cultivation has escalated substantially, especially the acreage. And paddy is a huge water consumer, water guzzler. And both, especially Bangladesh, has promoted paddy over the last 25 years. The acreage has increased manifold. We have data on that. So these are the problems that are there. Certain steps have been taken at a very regional scale without really understanding the impact at the scale of the basin.
That's really interesting. I think what I could get from your answer is also that I think there's a imperative need to look at data and undertake research in areas which move beyond just the economic spectrum of, say, the prices of production of electricity, but also look at how does it affect government's revenues through things like fisheries, through conservation,
Very
uh,
think about the ecosystem
and
livelihood
those are
linkage,
huge costs to it. Yes,
the social cost, ecosystem livelihood linkage, and eventually in the process, the fishermen's incomes are getting affected. Their livelihoods are
definitely.
getting affected. That's a social cost.
Yeah. Well, and I think that takes me to the that's a perfect segue to the next question which I had for Dr. Barua, especially when we look at this impact of climate change when we combine it with these unplanned, unfeasible projects which don't end up really meeting the kind of expectations that uh, the policymakers wanted them to meet in the first place. So, it, something that got me thinking was that climate change undeniably, takes the center stage for South Asian countries and largely most of the global South countries because the brunt of climate change impacts are being faced by the global South countries, and a lot of it is surrounding water. But at the same time, a lot of developing countries have not believed that they have not hit their industrialization potential. And this was also something which uh, became a very huge point during the G20 negotiations, where India took the stance that there is green industrialization needs to happen. We cannot deprioritize industrialization, and I think that trade-off which exists between economic growth and climate change is something which needs to be balanced. Now, as Dr. Ghosh pointed out, and you pointed out earlier as well, that the social cost to and the environmental cost of hydroelectric power generation is quite huge. So when we think about that trade-off in this particular context of environmental conservation and look at hydroelectric power as these technological endeavors which the South Asian countries or countries with rivers can rely on, what kind of nuances do we really need to focus on? And does this trade-off that we're talking about even exist in this case of hydroelectric power generation? And what are its implications for our futures?
Yeah, thank you. And I think let me start by saying that you mentioned this point about developing versus developed, and also the summit, the issues that came up in G20 summit. So I think one of the most important thing is that which India has always taken a position in, mostly in terms of climate negotiation internationally, that like domestically we would do what we need to do in terms of moving from non-renewable to renewable sources, but internationally we still have, except the Paris Agreement, which has now come up where we have voluntarily made a commitment. But before that, if you look at it, India has always ensured that there is this whole notion of differentiated responsibilities. There is a common goal, but the responsibility has to be differentiated, given that we are still a developing country. And today, what we see today in terms of CO2 emission is not really something that developing countries have actually created. And it's a fact, because CO2 remains in the atmosphere for long, almost 70 to 80 years. So which means that what we see today isn't something that has happened in the last 2 decades. So that is the first thing to start with. But if you look at countries like, in that case, I will also bring in China. Both China and India domestically, without making that commitment in the international level, have taken several initiatives to move from renewables to non-renewables to renewable sources of energy, be it solar, wind, or hydropower. Now, why? Why is something, as you again mentioned, that we also know that we cannot keep on adapting. Adaptation will become very, very expensive if we do not mitigate. So we have also started to look at mitigation option. Now, when you say mitigation option, the problem is that the impact or the outcome of this mitigation project is long term. The gestation period is high. You have to give a lot of you have to make a lot of investment, and these investments are mostly you have to you take away some chunk of money which you can use it otherwise today for something else. You use that money for investing on something which benefits you would probably see, or maybe the generation yet to come would see, right? So that's a very, very difficult task for the government. Let me tell you, it's very easy for us to say that why don't you mitigate? But when government sits together, they also want to be in power, right? They cannot just say, oh, we are doing everything for the next 30 years, but nothing for population today. So, but still, given that we are investing. Now, let me come to the most important point of hydropower. So let us all, I keep telling this in most of the forum that we cannot shy away from this fact that hydropower will come and will happen, whether it's in China or whether it's in India, because we do have that potential. So if you ask me, I don't see hydropower coming up as an alternative source of, generating energy as a big concern. The concern is how are we implementing it? As Nilanjan also mentioned, the costs. Most of the time, the cost is only the economic cost. Our impact assessments are also not well done. We also have very few, ecological economists who can actually impute values and tell you how you need to do this calculation. So that is, to me, is the major concern, because we are now talking about just transition, meaning when you are transitioning to a non-coal or non-fossil fuel economy to, say, hydro-based or solar-based economy, are you able to create enough jobs to be able to bring in all of those who are going to lose jobs in the process, right? So it's also about skill building. It's also ensuring that the place where you are, so resource, for example, let me give you an example of the Subanshiri Dam. So Subanshiri Dam is somewhere very close to Assam-Arunachal border. In the downstream, it is Dhemaji and Lakhimpur district. Now, what is the benefit people who are living in Dhemaji and Lakhimpur is going to see immediately? For example, in both these districts, these are flood-affected community, they migrate very often. Is coming of this operation is able to provide enough opportunities to the local community that they don't have to migrate. For example, are you able to bring a broader systemic change? So the job of NHPC or any NEPCO isn't only about bringing up that dam. They also have to have a broader objective of looking at that entire area where people will be displaced, where people may lose a lot of resources on which they had earlier access. Many of the channels may dry, like we see in case of Tista. What are your alternative arrangement for such things that is obviously expected to happen? And I think that's the bigger question, and that's where I strongly feel that we need to focus on. One more thing is that when we did our fieldwork in these districts where these transitions are happening, we really saw that some of the people were very happy. Why were they happy? Because they got jobs in the dam operation, right? But these jobs are so ad hoc in nature. But just imagine the kind of poverty they are living in, that for them, even this was good. But imagine making these jobs better, long term, building their skills. Do not bring people from outside, engage the local people. All of these actually will bring more positive narrative around this hydropower concern. So trade-off is there. It's about how do you manage this trade-off is the most important thing. Again, bringing a lot of transparency in terms of who is going to benefit, who is going to lose. You cannot go on with, Nilanjan will remember the Kelder and Hicks formula, where you say, okay, somebody is benefiting, somebody is not benefiting, but these benefiters are going to balance this. We are not living in those era now. So you have to bring everybody up together. And that's something I strongly feel everybody, including government, should think about, of having a good framework, which would change this narrative and also will reduce the trade-off that we are talking about.
That is fascinating, Dr. Barua. So I think when it comes to state capacity, when it comes to, and the nuance that you mentioned about livelihoods being such an important part of that trade-off, especially for developing countries, because I think for governments, and if you think about it political economically, then for the political economy to really sustain, for any government to remain in power, it becomes very necessary to ensure that most of its population is receiving that livelihood, and that can be the missing link. So I know Dr. Ghosh and Dr. Barua, both of you have spoken extensively about these core issues around transparency and data, around trust, around building that state capacity in order to implement, in order to make an informed decision and create informed policies and projects. Wanted to understand if what are some of the best practices, or what are some of those success stories around such river basins that have existed in the past, that we've seen around the world, that maybe we could learn from. I think for the large number of young people who are on the call, this could be a very interesting topic of research. So would love for both of you to shed some light on such examples that we can look at.
Okay, so I think Nilanjan, you go first and then I'll come.
Okay. See, of course, there are global examples of especially river basin organizations being developed. Now, very interestingly, if you look at the way Europe has looked at things, whenever there is any kind of a crisis, they get into some kind of a collaborative mode, create river basin organizations, which might be prima facie issue based, but slowly and steadily they will cover it all. They might start with fisheries, but fishery might be something that is being treated as the umbrella issue, and then possibly they will cover the issue, because if you have to have fisheries, you need to address the issue of pollution, you need to address the issue of flows. So these are some of the interesting models that exist, whether it's in the case of the Danube, whether it is in the case of the Rhine, or even in Asia, we have the case of a Himalayan river system, that is the Mekong. Mekong is a very, very interesting case. Suppose if you have a hydro-hegemon like China on the one side, it's the upstream, but you have a host of nations collaborating with each other and trying to maintain the flow regime to the extent possible, and including when you look at the way, in fact, they have maintained the delta or conserved the delta, it's exemplary. Now, Mekong has a very interesting org structure, in the sense that it is a combination of bottom up and top down altogether. You have representations from at the very grassroots level community in the river basin organization. At the same time, the kind of approach that you take, that fine, if this is the decision that is being taken, then it becomes to a certain extent binding on those who are participating, who are the participating nations. Now, the problem is that there you have one thing that we always need to keep in mind. It's also peaceful geopolitics that can essentially result in peaceful hydropolitics. So the geopolitical relations between nations is very, very important. If I at all have to think about a successful river basin organization or an RBO kind of a setup, we should have those enabling conditions in place. We have to understand interdependencies. This is something that often gets missing. So it might so happen that the transaction cost, that's a term that we often use as economists, of getting into a framework like an institutional framework like an RBO is too high when it comes to South Asia. So we have issues, we have problems, we address those problems as if there is no other problem that can emerge out of our redressal mechanism. But every solution also has an externality. That is something that we need to acknowledge. So that is why the movement, we need to have some kind of a paradigm shift in our thinking. And this is something that the hydro-technocrats need to acknowledge. And hydro-technocracy, this is another problem. I'm sure Anamika will also acknowledge this, since she has been scripting the national water policy, that our hydro-technocracy has been dominated by the engineering paradigm, the traditional reductionist engineering paradigm. And from reductionism, we have to move towards holism. It is not that an engineering technocrat is going to solve all the problems of the world. We have to have a multidisciplinary approach. You need economists like us, you need sociologists, you need engineers, you need seismologists, you need other scientists, you need other social scientists, and you also need the soft power to be in place. So hard data is important, transparency is important. You also need the soft power in place to come up with a more institutionalized, holistic framework of water governance.
Yeah, I can just take it from where Nilanjan, actually not that ended, but a lot that Nilanjan had mentioned, I completely agree. The last point that he made is so correct, because it's not just scripting the water policy, it is also when we had this project called Brahmaputra Dialogue, and when we were sitting down with many of the technocrats and also bureaucrats and hydrocrats. And the thing is that they always feel that whenever they see an opportunity, a river is flowing without getting, there is no intervention in that river. They feel that this river is there to use it, utilization of the river. That's the big problem that I have. Why we always say utilization of the river. You have to as if always use the river and get something out of it. It's also about the river is giving you something. It's not really high on the agenda. So that's where I think politicization needs to happen. We need to make it a political issue so that there will be some room for the river. And then coming to the other points that Nilanjan also had very clearly raised, I think Mekong is definitely a very, very good example. Even again, in most of our dialogue projects, we actually also presented the Mekong case to many of the bureaucrats. Why I like Mekong is because it actually had some 37 years of negotiation before it actually arrived as a treaty. It's actually more than negotiation. It was a dialogue. They were talking to each other. That is something I feel is so much missing in South Asian context. We don't talk to each other about something that, although doesn't require a lot of discussion. See, for example, Ganges Treaty. 30 years, we hardly spoke about what we want to do, how we want to do, which way we want to change it. Now that there is only 2 to 3 years left, now there is not even 2 years, only 1 year left, we are somehow kind of talking. And I keep asking this question also, and Nilanjan, you would agree, is that so much work has happened around Ganges now since it was signed. Are these work that academic community is pulling out? Will the negotiation consider these, discussions, these narratives, these nuances that is coming up? We don't know. So I think one of the most important thing is that how do you bridge the gap that exists between a lot of research that is created? Do we really use these, or these are just like an eye washer, or you want to read these, understand these, and go very well prepared when you are discussing about this river? Because Bangladesh is no longer what it was in 1996. It has changed. So that we have to always remember. The other thing coming to Mekong is that, as again rightly pointed out by Nilanjan, that they have multiple layers, and even the civil society get a space to talk. What is most interesting for me, for whether it is Mekong, whether it is Rhine, whether it is Murray Darling, the data is not secretized. It is available. Even public can get access to that data. Now, if we want to do a project where we want to understand the basin as a whole, I can never get access to the data, the Chinese data. The Chinese cannot get access to my data, even Bangladesh data. It's so difficult. So I think, why is it that? Because if you do not have proper understanding of the river basin, forget the boundaries, understand the river basin, any project, any intervention you will make, the answer, the outcome will be always questionable. We cannot even say it will have a lot of impact. We cannot even say it will have no impact, because we don't know. We are living in such a situation now that, as again, I have read Nilanjan's paper also, the hard data is missing. Without that data, how do you actually even claim anything? So that's the biggest concern. And I think politicizing data and politicizing disasters, this is really very bad. This needs to, and South Asian countries really does it. And that's where I think we need a lot of media attention, where they also understand the questions that needs to be raised rightly, that do not depoliticize these, whereas politicize the health of the river, politicize the ecosystem, which will get damaged. So I think yeah, I mean, I'm not going to repeat what Nilanjan has mentioned. I absolutely agree. Yeah, so these are the additional point that I wanted to just add.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barua. Those are some very, very intriguing insights for uh, policymakers to take a note of, for a lot of young researchers also to take into consideration when they are thinking about these things. And what I could get from both of your answers put together is that there are three I's which are really missing, right? There's institutions, there's incentives, and there is interest in making sure that these things are tied up together. So with that, I think I don't have any questions for the moment, and I would like to open it up to our audience for any questions that they have. So I'll just request anybody who has a question to raise their hands, and I can then recognize them. Okay, so it's Narasimhan Ramapriyan. You can please unmute, and you can also introduce yourself in short and then ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Abhishek. I see a lot of uh, elderly people, I wouldn't say, in the audience as well. I'm still in my 11th grade in my school. And, this is a quite big opportunity to be hearing from two great scholars here today. So, as Dr. Barua and Dr. Ghosh have, repetitively highlighted, with respect to the multifaceted approach that we need to adopt in order to conserve these, rivers and these biologically diverse systems of nature. So, my major question would lie in the aspect of power, where power intersects with this. So, we've highlighted the system of power at present. So, what would it be like in the future, given that the world is heading towards multipolarity and the power is being divided from probably one specified region to multiple such areas of the globe? So, how would the world in such a differently shaping environment adapt to, what is so necessary in order to conserve waters? How will that dynamic change affect what water politics is at the moment? That is what I wanted to know. Thank you. I would like an answer from both. Thank you.
Okay, Anamika, go ahead.
I think Nilanjan is well suited for this, but anyway, let me try to answer. First of all, I'm really impressed with your question being in class 11, and we want many more students like you who would be able to understand these nuances so well. Let me first tell you in a very, very simplistic way. One of the things that you see is there is a lot of hierarchy of knowledge. So power starts there itself. Like both me and Nilanjan are talking about that, it's so bureaucrats, hydrocrats, technocrats. Why not sociologists? Why not psychologists? Why not even economists are still a little higher in terms of in that ladder, but the other social scientists. Now, that is itself, it shows a power dynamic. So there is already a power dynamic there. Who creates the knowledge? Who are the actors? Then there is another power dynamic, who implements it. So what I'm trying to say is that given the present world order, I am a bit, unfortunately, not very hopeful that things are going to change in a very, very different manner. In fact, I think what is most important here is to understand that how do we keep ourselves aware of the changes that is happening in and around us so that we can at least raise our concerns whenever it is happening. So there is again this whole issue of, are we going to go ahead with a lot of hard power, like Niranjan mentioned about soft power? For example, construction of a dam can also be looked at as a hard power. Like, are we as a country genuinely feel that we need 10 dams, or we are constructing these 10 dams because we also want to send the signal out, we have the capacity and we are powerful and we want to show it to you, right? Similarly, data sharing. Data sharing, some countries, like again in South Asia, we don't want to share data. Let me tell you, that is also a way of showing power. You're also showing that I am the repository of data. So if you want it, you have to write to me. These are the process to follow. If I'm satisfied, I will share the data. So these are different forms of power, which is very much there. For these to change, I think this is why I said Nilanjan is a better person. I think our foreign policy also has to be very outward looking, where we are basically trying to say that, of course, nation first, obviously, But at the same time, there are certain things which we have to also take along with, like there are additional countries who has to work with us, otherwise our own benefits will be questioned, so this is something that I don't know whether I answered your question, but yes, power continues to be there. You cannot do away with the power, but how do you use that power in a positive way is something that is something that we need to actually get. Over to you, Nilanjan.
Yeah. So, Narasimhan, interesting question. Now let us look at who dictated our water systems approaches so far. It is the colonial engineering paradigm. So it is the colonial powers. And that's what we inherited from them. So the Britishers came to India. They stated that, well, you need constructions. And that's why you set up the Roorkee Engineering College. Well, Anamika sits in one of the engineering colleges herself and talking against engineers. So anyway, but that is how, in fact, knowledge is emerging. It is not against engineers, but knowledge as a holistic product by itself. So when we talk about now what has happened with these brick and mortar institutions, which are institutionalized in the form of the Central Water Commission and the Central Groundwater Board. Now, these brick and mortar institutions somehow haven't evolved with the ways the colonial knowledge system, or the colonial powers, the so-called erstwhile colonial powers have evolved in terms of the knowledge systems. Let us look at this fact. European Union decommissioned 1,200 dams by 2015. United States of America, which was heralded as, which actually talked about the dam building decades between 1920 and 1960, they decommissioned more than 500 dams by 2015-2016. Because they all realized that, well, those solutions worked at a point in time, but after that, knowledge has to evolve. It is not that these engineering solutions are going to help, but we have to take into consideration A, ecology, B, society, C, a more holistic economics. Now, when we talk about China, right, since you are talking about, said maybe a multipolar, bipolar, whatever tripolar world, US, China, if we are talking about these two poles, let's face it, China has possibly the best understanding of sediment science of the Himalayan river systems. US doesn't have it. But what NASA has done is to put across the entire hydrological data of the Himalayan river system in public forum, in public domain. You can access that. And the paper that Anamika was mentioning in terms of hard data, on the basis of which I have been arguing that there's quite a bit of, you know, uh, unnecessary rhetoric going on with the China-India hydropolitics, is actually the data which has been accessed from the NASA Giovanni system. It is neither from China nor from India. So who owns the power in such a scenario? Had this data not been in open access, I wouldn't have accessed it. Possibly NASA would have accessed it. They would have done their own analysis and they would have gone ahead with their entire hydropolitical narrative or their entire hydrological sciences enhancement. And in that case, they would have been better informed than any of the Indian scholars or any of the Chinese scholars. But the Chinese Academy of Sciences has its own data. In fact, if you the Yellow River Commission, they have a separate building altogether, a 5-floor or a 6-floor building altogether, which is dedicated only in researching on sediments of the Yellow Rivers. So this is the kind of depth or knowledge that is getting created in the process. So if knowledge is power, then in fact, I would say that the power dynamics is getting shaped as far as hydrology or water is concerned in this framework. We are not really getting there till this point in time, though we are also evolving. So two things. One is more data in public forum, which Anamika mentioned, by way of which we can have more informed debates, informed negotiations. B, with the data, more knowledge getting created. And in that process, you can create a more informed, integrated decision-making system.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh and Dr. Barua. I think those were brilliant insights, and it truly makes you wonder the way knowledge is being accessed, being created, and being propagated, and how we as researchers need to be mindful of how the data is collected and how we go about the data as well. Uh, so, thank you so
I
much
just
for
want to add one thing, Abhishek, out here,
yeah.
that it
Mhm.
also depends on the lens through which we are looking at the data.
Right.
As an engineer, I will look at the data through an engineering lens only. Just as, let me give you an example. For as far as the Kaveri, if you look at the Kaveri River Award, the final award, it simply comes up with a very reductionist mechanistic estimate, what we call arithmetic hydrological estimate, and says so much as water is vested, and this will be an unavoidable escapage to the sea. So whatever water is going to the sea is vested. Now, water going to the sea, every drop of water is an ecosystem service. That's not a vestige. So now this is the notion. This is the lens that through which I am looking at the data. Now, if Anamika is supposed to interpret the data, Anamika or I, we will interpret the data from the perspective of ecological economists. Well, every drop of water has, this is the value of the ecosystem service that this drop of water is creating in the process. So an engineer looking at it from a different perspective, an economist looking at it from a different perspective, an ecologist looking at it from another perspective.
So I think that's where the interdisciplinarity comes in. So you
Exactly.
cannot just make the data available to. So even me and Nilanjan looking at it from our perspective will not be
Right.
sufficient. We need other disciplines, right? So I think that's something very, very important.
Definitely. I think this was a really good discussion, and I did not hope to learn so many incredible nuances about hydropolitics myself. And yeah, so with that, I will give it to my counterpart from the India Foreign Policy Project, Christy Arora, to deliver the vote of thanks, and then we can end to this very incredible conversation.
Yes, am I audible? I hope I am, though.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Abhishek, for giving me the floor. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to extend a vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh and Dr. Anamika Barua, for not only sparing their invaluable time for us, but also enlightening us with their profound insights on this subject. We thank all the members who indulged in asking innovative and foresighted questions to keep this session truly engaging. I would also like to express gratitude towards Abhishek for moderating this session. This event would not have been possible without the profound contribution of division heads, members, and the founding committee of both the Indian Foreign Policy Project and Project Statecraft. A special thanks to B.R. Neeraj, Gurleen Kaur, Medhya Gupta, and Ajitesh Vishwanath. Lastly, we would like to thank the audience for their active participation and thoughtful engagement throughout the session. As we go towards the conclusion of this event, we hope to carry forward the spirit of dialogue cooperation that lies at the heart of diplomacy. Let's continue to think critically about India's way in the world and grow our shared passion for international relations and diplomacy through much more sessions in the future. Thank you all. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.